right, well, good evening, everybody. We've got a bit to cover tonight, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So, this is the third lecture of the first lesson on evolution. I know it sounds complicated, but I'm breaking my treatment of evolution into two different subjects. One is the argument from Folly, pretty much walking into evolution's own claims and showing how it all just doesn't work. And then the next one will be argument from truth, where now we walk into the biblical worldview and show how everything works. So this is the third lecture in the argument for folly, or argument from folly, showing why evolution simply does not work. So we will continue with that. I'll pray and then just jump right into it, because as I said, got a lot of stuff to cover. And as you've noticed in the last couple weeks, I've had a lot to cover as well. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. God, we thank you so much that we are able to gather this evening and really just learn what it means to contend for the faith that was once and for all delivered to the saints, Lord. That, the world makes its assaults against your word. It raises up lofty opinions against you, Lord Jesus. But we know that we're to take every thought captive, Lord, that we destroy arguments. So be with us as we do that tonight, Lord, and just show us again that every time the world tries to make their arguments against you, you always give plenty for us to know that humanity is a liar, yet God be true. And so we just thank you, God, for everything. I pray you'll be with me as I teach this material tonight. And it's in Jesus' name that I pray all this. Amen. All right, and just a little exhortation before getting into it. If you're not taking notes and you're not revisiting this, it's not going to be remembered. There's just too much, right? You think I just read this once and then all of a sudden I'm like out there spouting this off? No, had to read it multiple times, write notes, talk to myself in the mirror as if I was arguing with myself over these things, and then eventually it sticks. And so again, if you want to be able to fulfill 1 Peter 3:15 and 16, where we're to always be prepared to give an answer to those who question us for the hope that we have, then you got to prepare, because we're commanded to always be prepared. And so it takes a little bit of work. That being said, let me remind us of where we've been so far on this subject, and then we will continue. So far we've covered the general theory of evolution and the special theory of evolution. I've told you the difference. I gave you a description of the theory of evolution and its history, and then quickly showed how it doesn't work from a presuppositional standpoint. I mean, it assumes a random universe, but then wants to assume uniformity of nature. You can't have both of those together. And so we already showed how it doesn't work. And then I talked about the right way to use evidence. We don't use evidence against the evolutionist as if they just need more information. We're using evidence to show them that in their heart they are liars. They say they follow the evidence. They say that they're going to follow where the science goes. No, and so we show them with evidence that they're being arbitrary and inconsistent. And so then we started with some of the evidence. We first focused on their first claim. Their first claim is that life came from nothing, that life on its own emerged in some soup. It's called spontaneous generation, and we showed with probability that it's impossible. The numbers just don't add up. What they want you to believe happened could not have happened statistically. So we covered that. And then last time we covered uniformitarianism. The idea that this is the philosophy that evolutionists use to believe the universe and the earth is billions of years old. They think that if you look at the rates of how things happen right now, you could extrapolate it back into the past and you get billions of years. And then I mentioned how uniformitarianism is what they used in the 1800s, 1900s, but now they prefer the term actualism. And if you remember why, they're still uniformitarians, but they realize that it doesn't explain what we see in the world. They need catastrophes. Now we say everything's explained by one big catastrophe, the flood. Well, we can't believe that. So instead, what we believe is over billions of years, there have been enough big catastrophes in every part of the world at different times. And that's what accounts for it. And so the term for that is actualism. Really, it's just their way of trying to keep the deep time without having a global flood, which is silly. And I pointed out that they believe that a global flood covered Mars, even though there's not a drop of water on Mars. but they disbelieve that a global flood happened on Earth, even though we have enough water to cover all of our land by almost 2 miles if all the land was evened out. So it's just craziness. And that's why I'm saying that it's not about evidence. It's about they're suppressing the truth in their heart. And so we're showing all that. Okay, and then what I closed with last time, and I know it was kind of dense, but we talked about radiometric dating. Because, the evolutionist is going to say, well, we have dating methods that prove this rock is 4 billion years old. And so I explained how radiometric dating works, how really what they're doing is they're measuring the rate of decay from a radioactive substance, because in rocks you have things that are substances or elements that are radioactive, and over the course of time they will transition into a non-radioactive different element. And so the original radioactive element's called the parent, the non-radioactive part is called the daughter, and supposedly it takes a certain amount of time for half the molecules to transform, or half the atoms to transform from the parent to the daughter. And so what they do is they then say, okay, we know it takes this amount of time for that to happen, and so they could grab a rock and they think they could count backward. But I explained it rests on 3 assumptions. 1, when that rock was formed, there was no daughter already in it. 2, that when the rock was formed, it's a closed system, so nothing gets in and nothing gets out. And then the 3rd assumption is that the rate from parent to daughter stays the same and nothing affects that. And last time I showed you how all 3 of those assumptions are wrong. And they've all been proven wrong. And it's so fascinating that Mount St. Helens could blow up in 1986. And they could grab a rock from that and test it. And on these tests, it says it's billions of years old. Right? But we know that rock was born in 1986. So their assumptions are off. My point is, everything that they point to say, look, the earth is old, it's not. It's not. And so that's where we ended up last time. Oh, and I also brought up, if you follow their logic about, well, the present is the key to the past, if we apply that to the moon recession, if we apply that to the magnetic field, if we apply that to salt, getting from the land into the sea through erosion, the clocks don't work. All those show a much younger Earth, right? Same thing with topsoil and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting how they reject those clocks, but then the clocks that match their system, they'll accept. Again, these are not unbiased people. Yes, Al?
Just a quick question.
Sure.
I listened to your tape today.
Tape? Is this 1980? Okay, no, sorry, go on. Yeah, just kidding. I'm joking, Al. I remember tapes. They were wonderful. Yes.
Anyway, you mentioned the Mount St. Helens, and claims that that's a new rock, but it just came from down under and shot up. So
yeah, but it was magma that formed into a rock, right? And so when these guys are dating rocks, they're not dating magma, they're dating the rock. Right, and they're saying based on the elements that are in that rock, which formed from a bunch of things coming together all at once with that explosion, they would date that as the beginning of that rock is what they're dating, and they would date it as like hundreds of millions of years when we know it was formed in 1986. Yeah, but good question. All right, so getting into today's information. So up to this point, we've demonstrated all this stuff that I've just mentioned, and so now, and what we've seen is it's not looking good for the general theory of evolution, but our critique is not finished. Materialistic evolution, as I said, depends on spontaneous generation, which, man, I think we beat that horse to death with probability, but there's another angle in which we need to visit this idea that life can just spring up on its own, and it's the argument of irreducible complexity. In fact, a book was written on this years ago by Michael Behe titled Irreducible Complexity. And the idea behind this irreducible complexity is you could have something that is so complex, but you've reduced it down to its minimum point to where if you take anything out, it can't function. And so Darwin, a long time ago, recognized this would be the fatal flaw of his system. And so let me read the quote. I think I got it up there. Yes, I do. So here's what Darwin said. He said that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. In other words, what he's saying is if it could be demonstrated that organs or even the simplest cells could not emerge through successive and incremental changes, then his theory would be rejected. Okay, that's what he's saying. If you could show that something in its complex form had to start off that way, that it couldn't incrementally get that way, he said, my theory is done. And that is in Origin of the Species. Now, microbiologist Michael Behe elucidates this problem as it relates to Darwin's dilemma. He wrote this, and it's up there. He says, by irreducibly complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of these parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. An irreducibly complex system cannot be produced directly, that is, by continuously improving the initial function, which continues to work by the same mechanism. So it can't be produced directly by slight successive modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. Now, that's a complex statement, but I can reduce it a little bit, okay? You stinking microbiologist. Pretty much what he's saying is that you look at an irreducibly complex system, you can't say it came from something simpler before, because then it wouldn't be irreducibly complex. You just reduced it. In other words, what he's saying is you can't have any precursor. There's nothing, this is as simple as this cell could possibly be. If it gets any simpler, it's not a cell. It doesn't function. Okay, that's what he's getting at there. At least I think that's what he's getting at there. Now, so hopefully that makes sense. Even the simplest cell is made up of numerous biochemical machines that work together synergistically, meaning there's multiple parts that have to work together in a synergy, and if even one of those parts didn't work, the cell would die. And that's why we would say the cell is irreducibly complex, meaning its complexity can't be reduced without destroying the cell. It wouldn't be a cell if you take away even one part. Now, this damages the theory of evolution, the general theory of evolution, because irreducibly complex systems, they can't come into existence through evolution. Evolution's all about increments. You can't have increments on something that's irreducibly complex. Instead, something that's irreducibly complex had to appear instantly in that form. Okay? You can't build up to that form. It's irreducible. This is the lowest it could be. It had to start off that way. Now, given that both the simplest living cell and every multicellular system are all irreducibly complex, that means spontaneous generation and evolution cannot have occurred. It can't account for it. You can't incrementally bring proteins and amino acids and enzymes and voila, over time they turn into an irreducibly complex system. It doesn't work. And I'll give some examples of that. But remember 2 lessons ago, I discussed simultaneous and the simultaneous and synergistic relationship of DNA, ATP, and the ATP synthase motor. Remember that? How I brought up there's this motor, this wheel that's in every cell that's just amazing, and even showed you an animation of it. Well, remember, that motor, the ATP synthase motor produces energy that the cell needs. And the energy is called ATP. Okay, so DNA needs to be decoded. Okay, so there's a decoder that reads the DNA. But that decoder needs energy to do the reading. The energy is called ATP. But for the decoder to get the energy, there's this machine called the ATP synthase that creates the ATP for the decoder to read the DNA. But here's the mix in all of this. All the instructions for all this to happen are in the DNA itself. It's a wacky chicken and egg problem that is very hard to get around. All 3 of these, the DNA, the decoder, and the ATP synthase, they all had to pop into existence at the same time, working in perfect tandem with each other. 2 of the components won't work. 1 of the components won't work. It's all 3 of them. This is an irreducible complexity, and it is crazy to think that happened by random chance. Okay, you can't get to a living cell in increments. It's either all or nothing. Furthermore, those ATP synthase motors, that wheel that's in every single cell that I was talking about, it is highly complex and way more complicated and sophisticated than any motor we can make. In fact, the ATP synthase has an efficiency that is almost 100%. It turns at 10,000 RPMs. 10,000 RPMs, it produces 3 ATP molecules per rotation, and apparently scientists say this is as efficient as the laws of physics will allow for a physical motor operating with just about 100% free energy, and none of it gets lost. It's all going to what it's supposed to. Now, any motor we make, whether it's for a car or whatever, energy gets lost and becomes useless heat, okay? And this, nothing gets lost. I mean, a perfect motor. Okay, we are intelligent and we can't create a perfect motor. But these guys want you to believe a perfect motor happened to pop up by chance at the same time that DNA popped up and at the same time a decoder popped up, and they all just happen to interface with each other and work together. Really? I mean, come on. I mean, the tooth fairy sounds very reasonable right now compared to that. So, just saying, every single cell, including bacteria, has these motors. Life in both its simplest and most complicated forms cannot exist without all these components. So listen, no one would look at a motor vehicle, no one would look at the motor in a motor vehicle and believe that it just popped up due to random chance. Yet evolutionists and materialists are asking everyone to believe a motor that is exponentially more complicated than anything we can make popped up by chance. Silly. Furthermore, they expect us to believe it came at the exact same time as DNA, RNA, proteins, DNA decoders that somehow all started working together and became this living organism. It just doesn't make any sense. Imagine if somebody attempted to explain the existence of a car by referring to the metal and the other elements that the car was made from. The metal, the rubber, and all those compositional elements, they do not make it a car. Even though the car is made from those things aren't what make it a car. Okay, you could point to those materials found all throughout the rest of the world, and they're not a car. Okay, what makes a car is the design and operation of multiple machines all working together to produce a desired end. That's what makes a car, right? And that desired end is transportation. So in the same token, you cannot reduce living cells and organisms down to just carbon or hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. You can't. Those things aren't what make life, okay? Instead, these cells are complex systems comprised of irreducible machine-like structures that operate on this principle known as autopoiesis. And I know you guys all know what autopoiesis means. I mean, if you don't, what's wrong with you? No, anyway, autopoiesis refers to the fact that these machines, here's the crazy thing, these machines and these simplest living cells, okay, they are able to make, repair, and reproduce themselves by using energy and raw materials from the world around them. That's crazy. That sounds like design, right? You know, so like for example, I keep myself alive by grabbing a plant and some meat and eating it, and then my body's able to take that, break it down, and turn it into stuff that I need. Well, apparently these cells can do the same thing with what's around them. You think that's a matter of chance? I don't think so, right? So, anyhow, it's impossible for something like autopoiesis to emerge by chance, and yet it's an undeniable reality that exists in every cell. So Darwin's dilemma is real. What he wrote, like, if you could find this, my theory is shot. It's shot. This has been found. But the interesting thing is, evolutionists just move on like nothing ever happened. And that is the problem. Yes, Brian. I did not. We didn't get into the details of evolution. I remember in one of his responses, he said, you know, I don't know why you guys don't believe in evolution. The evidences for it are impressive. And then he put a couple links. And then I kept the argument at the presuppositional level and said, hey, I could share links too. That doesn't prove anything, you know. And then I think soon after that he quit. So, yeah. Yes, see what kind of response they put with it. I agree. It would be nice to see. I'm curious as to what they would say. All right. Yes, Charles.
Irreducible complexity.
Yep.
So then it kind of comes down into this idea that, so what you said, that the idea of an ontological necessity, right? There must be something that's self-existent, eternal, right?
100%.
Comes down to that.
A necessary being that is insanely intelligent to make something like that. I mean, we look at a cell to the naked eye. If you could see it, you probably need a microscope. But even with the basic microscope and you could see it, it just looks like a little thing moving around. But then you start getting into the details of that thing. It's more complicated than our most robust cities. You know, and so, I mean, that's just, I mean, that tells you the mind that's behind this all. Yes, exactly. All right, so the next one, yeah. So I'm going to kind of combine a bunch of things at once and just hit them really quickly. So the next problem with evolution is the synergistic nature of organs, because it's very similar to irreducible complexity. And what I mean is mammals. We're all mammals in here, right? We have hearts, lungs, and kidneys, and they work synergistically together, meaning if you have a heart without kidneys, too bad. If you have a heart and kidneys without lungs, too bad. You're dead. It takes the heart, the kidneys, and the lungs all to be working synergistically together, all contributing to the system together. And so that produces a very real difficulty for a theory that claims organisms develop over time, gradually. For example, a heart is worthless without the lungs and the kidneys. And if you have a partially developed heart, what good is that? What's a partially developed kidney, which each successive generation, those kidneys get more kidney-like? That makes no sense. You have to have fully functional hearts, kidneys, and lungs at the beginning. It has to start out that way. So that means for mammals to exist, all three organs would have to appear instantly. And I want you to understand, the evolutionist believes everything started as a cell. And then cells replicated and then eventually became multicellular. And eventually multicellular things turn into creatures. And those creatures develop organs. But how does that happen? They would assume over billions of years incrementally. How do you develop organs synergistically that come by increments? It doesn't work. So even the synergistic organ system itself is a form of irreducible complexity. Another difficult question, and listen, this isn't like 6th grade, so we're going to keep it mature, but another big problem for the general theory of evolution is sex. It just is. Okay, we know human babies come from the process of intercourse. I'll just leave it at that. According to the general theory of evolution, life, as I said, started as these little amoebas that popped out of this soup, and the amoebas did not reproduce through sex. Instead, they reproduce through cell division. So the cell just decides one day to copy itself. Hi, brother cell. And then they both copy themselves, and they just keep copying themselves. Cell division. That is a process way more efficient than sexual intercourse. It just is. Think of how much easier it would be to populate the world if you're just like, and then out pops another you. That would be amazing, right? And I mean, you don't have to go through all the stages of protecting the baby because it comes out just as you are right now. So here's the question. How does life go from one extreme to the other? How does that even happen? With gradual development, what good is a partially developed genital? You know, so at first creatures just reproduce by cell division, but then eventually, even while it's still making copies of itself, one of those copies has a partially developed genital. What good is that? Why would that be passed on to the next generation? Right? Natural selection would weed that out. Okay? It doesn't make any sense. Why would an organism develop that in reaction to the environment when the environment works just fine for you making copies of yourself? There's no environmental advantage to these updates, right? It's so much easier to produce another life form through cell division. The idea that life would evolve from cell division to something as complicated and as inefficient in comparison, that it would move from the efficient cell division to the inefficient copulation, that just doesn't make any sense. Now, evolutionists, they don't have a good answer for this, and they admit that. They readily know that this is a problem for their theory. They'll assert that, yeah, through increments in the course of time, this had to have happened. but we don't know how it happened. We have no plausible how or why to this. Instead, they give fantasy-based explanations, covered and baptized in academic vocabulary, but it's arbitrary. Now, to make this even a little more difficult, Walter Brown, he said this, I'm going to read a lot of what he says here. He says, if sexual reproduction in plants, animals, and humans is a result of evolutionary sequences, an absolutely unbelievable series of chance events must have occurred at each stage. And now he's going to list all the chance events that had to happen. Up there, I put it that it's you would need a bunch of fantastic coincidences. Okay, so anyhow, first thing is the amazingly complex, radically different yet complementary reproductive systems of the male and female must have completely and independently evolved at each stage at about the same time and place. Just a slight incompleteness in only one of the two would make both reproductive systems useless and the organism would become extinct. In other words, if a male developed the parts, but the female didn't develop the exact complementary parts at the same time, then it wouldn't happen. If the female counterpart developed it one generation later, well, the male that developed it dies and doesn't pass it on. So this had to happen. These synergistic systems where sperm and egg, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. B, he says the physical, chemical, emotional systems of the male and female would also need to be compatible. C, the millions of complex products of a male reproductive system, such as pollen or sperm, must have an affinity for and a mechanical, chemical, and electrical compatibility with the eggs of the female reproductive system. So they have to match together. How does that happen by chance, right? And then he says the many intricate processes occurring at the molecular level inside of the fertilized egg would have to work with fantastic precision, processes scientists could describe only in a general sense. He says then the environment of this fertilized egg from conception through adulthood until it also reproduced with another sexually capable adult who is also accidentally evolved would have to be tightly controlled. This remarkable string of accidents must have been repeated for millions of species. That's just what he's saying is think about what it takes. A male and female with all the right hardware developing at the same time, and that hardware just happens to work, okay? And then it happens to millions of species, and it happens in such a tightly controlled environment that each of these species, then their offspring could keep having the same success doing the same thing. From cell division to that, really, I mean, come on. It doesn't work. So it makes no sense to believe that all this arose through evolution and survived. Okay? It just doesn't. Because think about it. If evolution depends on natural selection, wouldn't natural selection favor the more efficient cell division over the less efficient sex? Now, the reason why both exist is both were created at the same time by God, and he created them for different purposes. But to have one evolve into the other, nope, doesn't make any sense. And then another issue that's related to this is cell division. Cell division itself presents a difficulty for this theory because the first cells or amoebas allegedly were these cell dividers. And so when they first started dividing, they were all identical. Well, what caused the cell division process to stop using identical cells and to start making different cells? What caused the first one to be different? Okay? To produce something entirely different, and then that different one produces something different. Listen, if you take a single piece of paper and you put it in a copy machine and you make that thing copy it 1 billion times, okay, and let's say that page is, I don't know, something from the book of Genesis. And that 1 billion times, it's still going to be the book of Genesis. There might be a couple ink spots and letters missing, but it's not going to come out as Hamlet, on one of those copies. It just isn't. It's still going to be the same thing. Maybe with errors from a loss of information, but not a generation of new information. That's the nature of how copies work. Okay, but the evolutionist is going to say, well, we want you to believe that mutations happened, which is a faith-based appeal, and these mutations created new information, which led to a new kind of cell, and this just kept happening and happening until we get to the kind of life we have now. Now listen, I'll talk about mutations probably next time. They do not get the evolutionists out of the hole on this. They don't. Once you see what mutations actually are and what they do, you'll be like, okay, yeah, this just doesn't work. You know, when you think about what the general theory of evolution is trying to be, it's trying to be a grand unifying theory, a gut. We all need a gut, not just the gut that processes our food, but a grand unifying theory, something that ties all knowledge and experience together. You can't just have all these separate things and be all right with it. Our grand unifying theory is the biblical worldview. Secularists don't really have one, right? They try to use evolution as one, but some would say, well, social sciences or biology or philosophy, and they see these as all separate from each other, but they need something to unify it because we have a unified human experience, and it's evolution. But as a grand unifying theory, this is horrible. It can't explain the origin of life. Okay, it can't explain how cell division turned to sexual reproduction. And a grand unifying theory that can't explain these is not a good theory. And then we could add to it another problem, right? We're all moral. Whether you're an atheist or a believer, you're moral. How does their grand unifying theory account for morality? Okay, and I talked about morality in the atheist lessons, so I'm not going to go back to that. I'm just going to simply say this. Evolution cannot account for it. Okay, what they would say is, well, originally, the original language-using life forms did not have morality. They lacked, moral notions during the early stages of evolution. But at some point, our brains got bigger, something changed, and natural selection caused us to move to the next level of self-consciousness where we moved from the realization of what is to what ought to be. So animals aren't debating, dogs aren't debating about what ought to be. Should we really eat hamsters? They're not debating that, they just eat them, right? And so they figured we were the same way. These evolutionists figured that all we looked at is what was in front of us, what is. And at some point we evolved to where now we could philosophize about what ought to be and developed morals and all that. Now, what's their evidence for that? None. You're not going to find that in bones. You're not going to find that in any rock they dig out of the ground. You're definitely not going to find it in any human records, because as soon as humans started leaving records, we were already moral. So all that to say, it's just another explanation they give, but boy, it sounds so smart based on the vocabulary that they use. But the bottom line is there is nothing in natural selection that's going to explain why we move from not being moral to being moral. Now, some people would say, well, evolution led us to this point because without it, we would have destroyed ourselves long ago. How do you know that? How do you know that? They say we have these morals because it preserves the species. That is such an ad hoc, made up, out of thin air explanation. And when they say it, you got to call them out. You got to say, that is not an argument, my friend. You just made that up. So anyhow, if life, and by the way, natural selection, really, a lion eats a zebra, feels no remorse in that. That's natural selection. How does that create a system in us then where we are merciful and we take care of those who can't take care of themselves? It's the exact opposite. It just is. So if life as we know it resulted from a series of random accidents that could be described as goo to you, then morality doesn't exist. It's an illusion. Ideas like eugenics would be okay if there's no morals, right? And yet scientists, even atheists, still consider it wrong, except some guys in some labs in China. But anyhow, something like CRISPR-Cas9 germline genetic engineering is still considered unethical by most scientists. Why? Because even if they don't believe morality is universally grounded, these people are still creatures made in God's image, and they can't escape their soulishness, their creatureishness. And that's why in the heart of hearts, all of us know certain things are wrong. We can account for it, they can't. And so don't let go of the moral argument. I think it's one of the best ones we got. Brian.
I would say, too, you can press to say that you can't even say you're you, because you're not really you.
Yeah.
Even what you think is you is just chemical processes just kind of playing out in this type of environment. You can't say that I'm me. And that's hard to deal with, right?
Yeah, like there is no cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Because the I think is just a lot of complex goo that you think is you, but it's goo up here. And really at the end, yeah, it just doesn't work. So that's a good point. Our consciousness, our self-identity, it's all an illusion in that case. Yes, Charles.
Do they try to make an argument for the explanation of unity and diversity by saying that amoeba, there's your unity, and then we decided to make something different? There you go, there's your diversity, and is that?
I don't know if they think that far. What I've noticed is a lot of guys who try to appeal to the science side say that's a question for philosophy and science doesn't answer those questions. So they think they could just pass the buck and not have to think about it. But the one thing I love about what we do as presuppositionalists is we don't let them off. We're like, you got to think about it because your science is not, it doesn't exist in abstract. It's part of a system and you do have a philosophy. And so I'm going to make you answer this question, so you want to press them on that. All right, so up to this point, our critique of the general theory of evolution, I think, has savaged the theory, but they're not going to give up. They think they still have a trump card, and I'm sure you've heard this before, the fossil evidence. We got the fossil record, so all this stuff you said is fine, but you know what? I could ignore it because of the fossils. And because of that, our critique would be remiss if we don't address the fossil record. Because evolutionists claim that the fossil record proves that evolution occurred. Not only that, I'm sure you've seen biology textbooks that present all these drawings that demonstrate the progression of ape-like creatures up to modern humans. So the question, and they say this is all based on fossil evidence. So the question is this based on hard, factual fossil evidence? And the answer is no. And I'm going to be talking about fossils, for some time to come, today and up through the next lesson. But what I'll tell you up front is that the fossil record demonstrates that life appeared abruptly, with systematic gaps between various kinds of creatures. Furthermore, there are hundreds of millions of fossils in museums across the world, but not even one of them is an indisputable missing link. Okay, missing link or transitional form where you could say, okay, this one here is half bird, half dinosaur. Here's the proof. There's nothing like that. And I'll go over some of the things that have been claimed to be, but they're not. And very few people are still trying to say that they are. Okay, now the notion of human origins from ape-like ancestors, that problem is even worse, right? Because the pictures in textbooks, they're just based off bones. Okay, these are artist imaginations. And some of the artists have been told that they are instructed by the scientists, well, because we believe this one's dated at this time, draw them to look more like a human. But it's not based on the artist or even the scientist really knowing what this thing looked like. Again, it's artist conceptions. It's not based on facts, but presuppositions. And that shouldn't surprise us because we've been talking about presuppositions nonstop for a very long time. It's because our presuppositions and theirs are different that we come to different conclusions about the fossil record. You see, the fossil record, it's not like a historical record produced by humans that tells a story. It's not like you're pulling up, the annals of Sennacherib as he's talking about everybody he conquered back in the ancient Near East. That's a historical record. If you know the language, that you could read it and understand it. That's a human record. That's a historical record. Fossil record is just artifacts that people have recovered from the ground. Humans then interpret those artifacts based on their presuppositions, and then they create a story. It's not the artifacts creating the story. People, based on their presuppositions, are creating the story. Now, evolutionists have developed a system of fossil classification known as biostratigraphy. Okay, biostratigraphy. And what it does is because if you remember, stratigraphy is taking like the geological ages, if you will. Like you look, this layer is from this age and this layer is from this age. And then you add the word bio in front of it. Okay, so it's combining biology and geology together. And of course, this relies on uniformitarian assumptions and evolutionary assumptions. And so pretty much what they say is you take the life where you find it in the rocks and what we believe about those rocks, that layer based on our uniformitarianism. Okay, that's how we're going to date these particular life forms. So if this life form is in a layer that we believe is a billion years old, then that life form existed a billion years ago. And so that's how they're then coming up with their story of life in its progression through the fossil record. Okay? Pretty simple. So, this system, by design that they created, actually only produces conclusions that will ever agree with it. And it's very circular in its reasoning. How do you know this life form is as old as is a billion years old? Well, because that layer is a billion years old. Okay. How do you know then that that layer is a billion years old? Because the life form we found in it existed a billion years ago. You see the problem, right? It just doesn't work. And it's funny that we will find life forms in these layers that are 2 billion years old, and the fossil looks like something that's a living creature today, but they're like, well, it can't be. Why? Because of their assumptions. It's crazy. So we're going to see as we go on that even when they have no evidence, right, they're still going to come up with evolutionary conclusions, and I'll give you one in a minute. But it's interesting to note that if their assumptions were true, namely that these sedimentary rocks accumulated throughout Earth's history and that the proliferation of fossils correlates with that accumulation of rocks, then the fossil record should contain multitudes of these missing links. We should find a whole bunch of them up through these layers of these rocks that link the consecutive evolutionary stages. Is that what we find in the fossil record? No. And evolutionists and their supporters, they don't regularly advertise that. You know, they know it's true, but they're not out there advertising it. They want you to feel like, no, the fossil record has abundant evidence. It doesn't. Now, sometimes they will let the truth slip out. For example, the late Dr. Colin Patterson provided no pictures of transitional forms in his book, Evolution. He wrote a textbook called Evolution, and then people questioned him like, hey, why didn't you put pictures in there of missing links? And he said, because I don't even know of one that exists. And keep in mind, this guy was the senior paleontologist of the British Museum of Natural History. And he said, I will not put one in the book because we don't have even one indisputable example in the fossil record of a transitional creature. So he's like, I'm not gonna do it. And then this one I've always loved. He's also passed away, the late Harvard professor Stephen Jay Gould, America's premier paleontologist, similarly admitted that there's no evidence of transitional forms in the fossil record. So his answer to this is a relatively recent theory called punctuated equilibrium. Okay, punctuated equilibrium. And just to explain this, what he said is like, we got this all wrong. Rather than life evolving over long periods of times, you know, from lower complexity to newer life forms, what punctuated equilibrium says is that the changes actually don't occur over time, that there's no change for a long time, and then in a short period, there's a bunch of change. So you get all this evolution at once, and then you get a long time of no evolution again, like millions of years of nothing. And then another short spout of maybe 100 years where a bunch of evolution happens, and then another long period. And now, why did he come up with this explanation? Because it provides evolution in a way that doesn't need evidence, right? It provides evolution in a way that doesn't need evidence. In other words, he's saying, here's the reason we don't have evidence for this. It's not because evolution's not true. It's because evolution happened in such a way that it leaves no evidence, but we should still believe it anyway. So pretty much, if you have no changes over millions of years, but then you get rapid changes maybe in a 50-year period, there's not enough time for them to form fossils. So you're not going to find the transitional life forms. So just let that remind you that it should bewilder us that the evolutionists have the audacity to say we creationists have blind faith. Just understand that the premier paleontologist of Harvard said evolution happened in a way that left no evidence. That's faith, right? Now, guys like Richard Dawkins hate the fact that Gould said that. And so he has this empty bravado where he says, no, Gould, he doesn't make any sense. The fossil evidence is abundant, okay? It's abundant. Yet Gould, again, says, no, we need a new theory to explain this. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould, he wrote this. He said, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. Okay, as I said, evolution happened in a way that leaves no evidence. The fossil record actually does not support their theory, is what he's saying. Okay, so what that signifies to us is that their assumptions of biostratigraphy are incorrect. They're incorrect because if their assumptions were right, we should be finding these missing links. Okay, so then you might be thinking, all right, I've opened up some evolutionary textbooks. I've seen the detailed trees of life, that connect this animal to this one and, throughout time. And so you might be wondering, well, aren't those based on real evidence? No. Concerning what the textbooks show with those trees, Gold, again, Stephen Jay Gould writes this. He says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches, not the branches themselves. In other words, this stuff appears abrupt. He says we got nothing to connect them. Continuing, he says this is not, he's like, the rest is inference, not the evidence of fossils, end quote. So, when the evolutionist appeals to the fossil record, the Christian must understand it is a very weak appeal. Okay, and so the more we know about this, the better equipped we are to say, hey, that's a weak appeal. Okay? So, people like Gold should serve as a lesson for us that the evidence is going to be interpreted in accordance with the person's presuppositions. An evolutionist like him is going to assume evolution's true. And he's going to come up with interpretations to nullify the ramifications of the evidence that hurt his position. He noticed the fossil record shows that life appeared abruptly, like we would believe, and it was complete. It appeared in its complete forms, like creationism demands. But rather than him moving to creationism, he postulated that evolution occurred without leaving evidence. This is why evidentialism's philosophy is off. This guy had all the evidence in the world that, the real world actually looks more like creationism. And rather than him saying, therefore, the evidence shows me, now I'm a creationist, instead he says, therefore, evolution happened in a way that left no evidence. Again, presuppositions. You're never going to change somebody's heart just with evidence. And somebody like Richard Dawkins could ignore the lack of fossil evidence. He can say that there's a bunch of it, but that's just the emperor has no clothes. He's insisting against reality that there's evidence available to everybody, even if it's scant or non-existent at best. So the extremes of Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins are why this debate cannot really center on a comparison of evidence. It has to occur on one's presuppositions. Now, they're going to say, well, you guys do the same thing. You're guilty of interpreting the facts according to your worldview. Yes, thank you. I wanted you to say that. We invite this challenge. You now admit you do it. We admit we do it. Now let's go to our presuppositions and see which ones are true. Okay, which of the two worldviews meets the necessary preconditions of intelligibility? And now we will demolish your view the same way we did in the atheist lessons. But, as I said, it's a good idea to use the evidence to show how they're inconsistent and arbitrary. Okay? That's really where we're going with this. Now, what we see when we look at the evidence, especially through our Christian presuppositions, is that the overwhelming amount of fossil evidence actually fits our worldview. The flood explains it a lot better than biostratigraphy. And again, I'll have to explain that when I get to the argument from truth. Okay, but all this just, again, reinforces the fact that these people are arbitrary. Now, first thing to note is that the fossil record consistently demonstrates that the expectations of evolutionists are almost always opposite of what the record reveals. They make predictions and say the record should show us this, and the record always shows the opposite. For example, if evolution were true, we should expect species to slowly diverge from each other until they evolve into the higher taxonomies, like kingdoms and phyla, right? That's what you would expect from evolution, that it starts here and it moves up into kingdoms and phyla. But in the fossil record, kingdoms and phyla are always the first to appear in the fossil sequence. Exactly what you would expect in creationism. Okay? Another example of it not matching, their predictions not matching what we see, is found in the quartz sandstone of Venezuela. Pollen was found in that sandstone, and specifically the Roraima formation, but that formation was radiometrically dated at 1.8 billion years. 1.8 billion years ago, according to biostratigraphy, you did not have plant life existing. And yet we're finding pollen in those rocks that date to a time where there were supposedly no plants. So again, the data does not match their predictions. Okay, they simply, and what do the evolutionists do? They write it off as a paradox. Well, we have no answer. It's a paradox. It's a mystery. Somebody will figure it out. A similar paradox can be found in Australia's Flinders Range, where a fully formed vertebrae was discovered in a place far too early for vertebrae to exist. Like in that chunk of rock, it was supposed to be way before the first vertebrae appeared. And there one is, fully intact. How'd that guy get there, right? So again, what we find does not match their predictions. Now, the most glaring example of this, and so if there's any little kids here, because little kids love dinosaurs, we'll be talking about dinosaurs for a little bit, right? The most glaring example is the 2005 discovery of the soft, non-bony tissue in a bone of a Tyrannosaurus rex by Mary Schweitzer. Okay, the tissues included ligaments, blood and cone cells, flexible blood vessels, proteins like collagen, and DNA. I remember watching the 60-minute clip where she's taking it with tweezers and she's stretching this stuff. Okay, this was living, or not living, I mean, obviously the dinosaur is dead, but this was preserved tissue. Tissue, the DNA, all that stuff, blood, it's crazy. Now, after this discovery, non-fossilized organic remains have now been found in multiple dinosaur species. So it's not just one. This find has been repeated all over the world. Now, this is a problem for the evolutionists because dinosaurs went extinct supposedly 65 million years ago. And here's the reason why this is a problem. Okay? Soft tissues and blood vessels cannot survive 65 million years in any circumstance. They just can't. For that reason, Dr. Schweitzer was alarmed, and she was even scared at first about publishing the results of her research. She's a committed evolutionist, and she knew people were going to come after her. And they did. They did. She got trashed for this, even though it was undeniable. Listen, DNA is found in her sample, and DNA decomposes rapidly. Let me give you the figures. Okay, these are the following facts. DNA that's protected inside a bone at a temperature of 77 degrees, moderate temperature, that DNA would completely disintegrate after 22,000 years. Okay, we're talking 65 million years ago these went extinct. That tissue could not survive more than 22,000 years. Now, let's make it more favorable to them. What if the bone was in 59 degrees? So it's colder. 59 degrees instead of 77. Okay, it would disintegrate in 131,000 years. Okay, let's put it below freezing. 23 degrees. It would last less than 900,000 years. Not even a million years. They need it to last 65 million. Okay, 900,000 is far away from 65 million. It should be impossible that we are finding this kind of tissue. Okay, and by the way, the bones she found were not frozen. And so again, it only makes the problem worse. The scientific evidence shows then that dinosaurs are not as old as they said they are. They could not have gone extinct 65 million years ago. The evidence shows that they had to have been around at least less than 22,000 years ago. Okay, that's what the data shows. But they won't accept it because of their theory. Now, the media rightly dubbed Schweitzer's discovery as the dangerous discovery. Why is it dangerous? Because it undermines their view. The evolutionary establishment has worked very hard to dismiss it. At first they said, oh, no, that's not tissue. That's bacterial film that mimics soft tissue. But then she answered that objection because she ruled that out pretty quickly. And then they tested it and they're like, okay, she's right. And that got dropped. So pretty much everybody admits, okay, this is actual dinosaur tissue. And then they say nothing else and they move on. Their theory is left intact. Brian.
You have a quote of her saying there's DNA there?
A quote offhand, I probably do, but not in my notes. Because I know she's block quoted in some of the books I have. And I know that when Dr. Sarfati came here and gave his presentation, he actually showed about 5 minutes of her 60-minute clip where she was on 60 Minutes and she was saying it and then it showed her stretching it and all of that. Yeah, so yeah, it's out there. It's out there. It should be easily findable. AI could probably pick it up just like that.
Well, ChatGPT is saying there is no.
Really? Interesting. You might have to change the prompt on that because this is something that, like, yeah, she answered that no, this is DNA.
So I'm curious, how many people actually say that?
Well, that makes me curious now, so I'll have to look that up
Why don't you take these slides and just drop it in there and just have it
and having it look. That's one way to do it. Now, one thing I'll add to this. So we got DNA, or we got tissue at least, right? So let's say the DNA is not there. Still got blood, tissue, all that kind of stuff. That could not have survived more than 22,000 years. That puts them in a more recent time frame. The historical record does as well. And so I'm going to show you some pictures of human records of what I believe are dinosaurs. Humans called them dragons. And so scientists are like, well, they can't be the same thing. Dinosaur is just a word that was invented like in the mid-1800s. Just because they were called something different before that. But anyhow, and just to let you know, some of these were brought up to paleontologists. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. And he said, I don't care what it looks like, it can't be a dinosaur. But it looks exactly like one. Yeah, but no human ever saw a dinosaur because they died 65 million years ago. But here you have a human that drew one. Yeah, no, coincidence. Right, well, we're going to look at a lot of coincidences, okay? And so I'll give quick explanations of these. This guy right here is in the Natural Bridges National Monument in Utah. This is a rock carving done by the Anasazi Indians before the year 1200, okay, before the year AD 1200, and it clearly shows a sauropod, okay? A sauropod would be like a brontosaurus, that kind of thing. Come on, guys. I mean, seriously. I mean, it's a spitting image. This next one was found near the border of Mexico and Guatemala in the middle of a jungle. There are petroglyphs carved, and they glow at dusk, and so that's why that you have that glowing picture. One of them looks like a Hippocrasaurus. So the one on the left is the actual petroglyph, and then to the right, this book that I took this from shows you what that particular dinosaur looked like. And they're pretty stinking close, right? So you got that. And then in Peru, here's a vase from the Wari people that was produced no later than the year 900. So it could be before 900, but not after it. And on the vase is a creature that looks like a protoceratops. I mean, yeah, we've seen those kind of dinosaurs in books, right? And then also in Peru, you have the Chansey people, and they were really good at making figurines. And this figurine dates to no later than the year 1450, and it looks like a sauropod called the Musaurus. So there you have that one. This one is very interesting. Let's jump across the Atlantic Ocean to England. At Carlisle Cathedral, which was built in the year 1122, a certain bishop was then buried in that cathedral a couple centuries later in 1496. Now, on that bishop's tomb, they decorated it with brass engravings of a lot of recognizable animals in England: a bird, a pig, and a fox. And with those animals, normal animals in England, they also drew these two other animals fighting each other. And this wasn't like some mythical thing. It was put right next to the other animals that are real animals. Yes, Charles?
So these wonderful stories you read about knights going out to take on...
In every culture. Yeah, so you got every culture, knights going and killing these dragons. Yeah.
Wow.
I'm sure dinosaur meat must have tasted good. I don't know. Maybe it tasted like chicken. But the thing is, this decoration here shows that the artist considered these animals to be known animals to the people of the area. And it's clearly two dinosaurs battling it out. The one on the left, since it has a spiked tail, looks like a sauropod that we know as the Shunosaurus. It's like a brontosaurus, but with like a stegosaurus mighty tail, which is really cool. And then the one on the right is something different. I forgot what it's called, but the point is, these kind of dinosaurs, the ones with the spike on the tail, their fossils have only been found in China. But here it is drawn in England in the 1400s. It's just very interesting. Oh, and then the animal on the right that doesn't have the spiky tail is called a volcanodon. So again, these look like dinosaurs that we know about. The next example here is from the Netherlands. It's from the famous Castle de Haar. And In that castle, there's this ornate book that dates to 1440, and there's a beautiful picture of the legend of St. George. So many countries have the St. George legend, right, where he slays the dragon. But interestingly enough, every country has a different looking dragon. But all their dragons look like known dinosaurs. So it implies that, of course, it was a known dinosaur to each region. In this particular picture in the Netherlands, the dragon happens to look just like a dinosaur called Coelophysis. A Coelophysis bowery, which is a dinosaur that supposedly lived 200 million years ago. And yet here it is drawn in a document almost 600 years old. And so on the bottom is what the dinosaur looked like. And then on the top is the actual picture in this 1440 magazine, or not magazine, but book. This next one comes from France. At the Royal Chateau of Blois, I'm sure that's not pronounced right, but it has a carved stone that looks like a Plateosaurus. And then, of course, you jump over to Spain, España, and you have a different version of St. George killing the dragon, stitched into an altar cloth that was made in 1600. Now, the interesting thing is the head, teeth, and body of this thing. So you've got three things, okay? Head, teeth, and body. Like if it was just the teeth, you could say, all right, coincidence. If it's just the head, you could say coincidence. But when the head, teeth, and body all specifically look like the Nothosaurus that lived 250 million years ago, supposedly. I mean, this is what the people in Spain saw. 400 years ago, somebody sewed something that looked like that particular dinosaur. And yeah, that thing looks crazy with his big old mouth. And yeah. So anyhow, and now we're going to jump from Europe over to China. So we were in the New World with Peru, Mexico, Utah, and then we jumped to Europe with England, Netherlands, Spain, and France. Now let's jump to China on the other side of the world. This was produced by the Hongshan culture. They carved a lot of items out of jade, and this one is a jade pendant that's over 4,000 years old, and it looks like a Gracilloceratops, which, yeah, very interesting. And then this one, also from China, is a turquoise dragon, also over 4,000 years old, and it looks like a Centrosaurus. And then the final one I'll show you is this turquoise dragon, also 4,000 years old, and it looks like a Protoceratops, almost like a Triceratops type thing, but this one's called a Protoceratops. And there's this one, I wish I would have found it. There's this one that is, so in Cambodia, you have that massive city of the king, and you have all these engravings on the wall, and one of them is straight up a Stegosaurus. I mean, it looks like it has the little flaps on the back and the spike tail. I mean, it's like, and that is also only about 400 to 500 years old. So these people saw this stuff long before we ever dug these things out of the ground and gave them a different name. Yeah. Now, at this time, because we'll finish up pretty quickly. I'll try to get through the rest of this really fast. It would also benefit us at this time to understand how fossils are even formed in the first place. So again, the fact that humans saw dinosaurs, that's obvious. Now I want to get back to fossils. How do fossils even form? Because this becomes another problem with the evolutionists' position. Uniformitarians believe that they form according to the normal processes today. Like they would say a fish dies, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, it slowly gets covered with sediment, and over time that sediment, gets pushed into it and it becomes a fossil. Now, evolutionists admit though, well, we don't actually ever observe this in the present. We just assume this is how it happens. Because the problem is, what happens to dead creatures usually? Usually they're eaten, or they decompose before a bunch of sediment can bury it, right? And then it becomes fossilized. So due to this reality, geologists will regularly invoke catastrophes. They'd be like, well, yeah, if an animal just dies and it's lying out in the field, birds are going to eat it. So the only thing that could bury something rapidly is a catastrophe. So it'd be like, okay, so you believe in the flood? No. We believe in multiple catastrophes that just happen to happen all over the world at different times. Okay, but you also believe it happened in every era because you have fossils in every supposed era. So again, they're not very consistent. But what they do agree upon is that the dead creature must be immediately buried and encased in sediment for a fossil to form. And again, catastrophes are really the only explanation. And Occam's razor, go with the simplest explanation. Since you have these catastrophes in all parts of the globe, Why not just assume one giant global catastrophe could explain it all? Now, I want you to consider some examples. The Dinosaur National Monument in Utah contains hundreds of enormous dinosaur bones that were buried together in a thick deposit of sediment. So ask yourself this: what would it take to bury so many large land creatures all at the same time? It would take a flood. And you might think, okay, yes, that's our creationist answer. Evolutionists agree. It would take a flood. Okay, but instead what they say is, look, all these beasts died at the same time due to a drought. Okay, a drought happened, they starved, they died. And then when the drought ended, it ended because a giant flood came and buried them all at the same time before they could decompose. What's the evidence of this? None. It's a just so story. I know I throw the word ad hoc a lot. That is what evolutionists are guilty of. It is a just so story. They simply assert that floods had to happen on every continent to explain the fossil record, so they just made up a flood for those ones instead of believing in the global flood. And then you have this other one. You have a fossilized plesiosaur in Queensland, and then a herd of 25 dinosaurs found in Mongolia in 2009. And again, they were all killed by floods. So 25 dinosaurs buried by floods in Mongolia, another one buried by a flood in Australia, a bunch buried by a flood in Utah. Come on, I see a simple answer to this. A global flood happened everywhere they were and buried them. But I guess it just doesn't work for the evolutionist. You know, and the thing is, these dinosaurs all are found in a posture that suggests drowning. And then, of course, I've always loved this one. Fossilized sea life found on the highest parts of Mount Everest. And jellyfish fossils found in Wisconsin, next to all the cheese. You know, Wisconsin is nowhere near the ocean. That is smack in the middle of our continent's interior. How the heck do you get a fossilized jellyfish there? And then again, fossilized sea life on Mount Everest. Really? Okay, so neither uniformitarianism or local catastrophes adequately explains the findings within the fossil record. So, up to this point, we've seen that the fossil record demonstrates advanced life forms appearing way too early for their evolutionary story because they're in the wrong sediments. We've also seen that the record yields dinosaur soft tissue, which is an insurmountable problem for evolutionary timelines, so they just ignore it. And then the record also reveals that fossils were formed by catastrophic means all over the earth. Okay? So the record is not producing the results one would expect if evolution were true. It's producing the results if creation were true, specifically the biblical account of creation. As stated earlier, the discovery of fossilized transitional life forms, that's their most important prediction. And we can't find anything. Okay, and whenever they do say we found one, it gets all this great media fanfare. It's on every front page. And then 6 months later when they say, oh yeah, this was just a bird, it's in a small little section on page 49E of the New York Times, and it's never reported. And that's dishonest, and it's intentional. Now, most of the so-called transitional forms just demonstrate small-scale variation within a basic kind, which is an idea that we creationists hold. If God created each kind with a robust genetic diversity with the capacity to change by adaptation, we would expect speciation to happen to branch out from each kind. And in such case, we would predict those adaptations result from a loss of genetic information rather than a gain. And that's exactly what we see in the real world. So, in what sense then could these examples they give be transitional forward movements of evolution when they're just lost information? And these examples never point ever to a transition from one kind to another. They are always a fish becoming a slightly different fish. Okay, you don't have a fish becoming a bat. Okay, that doesn't happen. It's still a fish. And that hardly constitutes positive evidence for transitional forms or missing links. At best, it's just non-discriminating evidence. Okay, this new fish came into existence from this other fish. That doesn't hurt you or us. It doesn't help you or us. We both could explain it. You explain it with the special theory of evolution. We explain it with speciation that we derive from what we'd expect from Genesis. Now, I do have to say, though, that occasionally, evolutionists present some fossils as big proof of a transitional form favorable to their theory. And so we'll talk about just two big examples. The first one, which is still quoted a lot, is the Archaeopteryx. And this creature was hailed as the missing link between dinosaurs and birds. You'd often see it on magazines where you'd have a feathered dinosaur. Be like, this is the one, this is proof. Now, later, it was demoted. It was demoted from a dinosaur bird to just a bird that was an ancestor to birds. But then later, in 2011, it was demoted back to being a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with no feathers. It was just a theropod, okay? And that was based on a fossil they found in China. It's called the Geotinia Archaeopteryx, right? And so once they found that one, they're like, okay, we know this is just a dinosaur. But there's some guys who have just held out and said, no, we're going to give it bird dinosaur status again, even though the new fossil finds completely killed that. And so the point is, this is not a transitional species. Furthermore, when you think about just because a dinosaur and a bird kind of look similar, like the way they stand, you have to look at the differences between them. Their bones are different. Bird bones are hollow. So you should be able to tell, are these reptile bones or are these bird bones? These are reptile bones. And so what evolutionists do is they try to blur the lines between the two to where they allow a single creature to toggle back and forth between the two ideas based on whatever the group's latest fancy is. Okay, now an earlier candidate for this kind of thing was the Sinosauropteryx, which allegedly had feathers, only later for them to say, oh, what we thought were feathers was just collagen under the skin. So it wasn't feathers, it was collagen. And to date, every example of a dinosaur to bird transitional form has been disproven. All of them. And true to form, in each case, the mainstream media rarely provides the same fanfare of like the anti-announcement. See, when they announce it, oh, they found it, a lot of fanfare. But when it's like, okay, it's been debunked, no fanfare. It's just really dumb, really dumb. Now, one can justifiably wonder why evolutionists would seek this kind of transitional form in the first place. And that's why, like the last bullet I have there, is it's foolish. It's folly to try to look for a transitional fossil here. I mean, really, like, if I were an evolutionist, I would not be looking here. I wouldn't be trying to find the bird dinosaur. It's silly. I'd be looking somewhere else. And here's why. The differences between birds and reptiles comes down to a lot more than just feathers. It comes down to warm-blooded versus cold-blooded. How do you get that? It comes down from reptile versus avians. Different organs, different everything. The reptile lung versus the avian lung. All these things. Even if you were actually to discover a dinosaur with feathers, it would not prove that birds are their descendants. Because it still has the reptile organs. It still has the cold blood. It still has all of that. There's just far too many things that would have to change to get from dinosaur to bird. Feathers are the least of the problems. Listen, flying birds have bodies that center their weight in balance for flight. And they have the hollow bones, as I mentioned. The hollow bones are actually part of their breathing system. I don't know if you know this. They breathe through their bones. Their bones are part of the system. The bird's muscles are strong. Their tendons function as pulleys in their shoulder bones. That does not happen for reptiles. Birds have their sharp vision. Reptiles often don't. And their feathers are designed perfectly for flight. Now, the evolutionists will claim that, well, these are just modified reptilian scales. That's all a feather is, a reptile scale that's been modified through evolution. But that's nonsense. Scales are folds in the skin, whereas feathers are complicated items with a barb, barbules, and hooks. Moreover, they originate from follicles inside of the skin, much like human hair. Some of us have few follicles, or dead follicles, we'll put it that way, and then some have many. But feathers are more related to hair than they are to scales, is the point with that. And feather proteins, which are phykeratins, are biochemically, phi is in the Greek letter phi, they're phykeratins. They are biochemically distinct from scale proteins, which are alpha keratins. And so you can't say a feather is just modified reptilian scales. You look at them in a microscope under magnification, they are absolutely unrelated to each other. And so any explanation offered by an evolutionist as to how scales become feathers when they are as night and day from each other, anything they say is just another ad hoc, just so story. In addition to feathers, the lungs pose a massive barrier to the evolutionist imagination as well. Reptile lungs are kind of like ours. They're a bellowing system. In, out, two different directions. Some comes in and then something else comes out. We breathe in one thing, the oxygen, then we breathe out the carbon dioxide. It's a bellowing system. You know, birds don't breathe that way. They have the avian system. They have these air sacs and then their bones. And the air comes in and just goes in a straight circle. It doesn't come in and out. It's a one direction. It's fascinating when you look at it. There is no conceivable way that a creature goes from a bellow system to a single direction avian system. None. It makes no sense. You couldn't possibly come up with a way where that could even be possible. The two systems are actually incompatible. So again, how could a reptilian bellowing lung incrementally evolve into a contradictory breathing system? So evolutionists, they insist on dinosaur to bird evolution just because they want to believe it. That's the problem. So with all that, we're done. Okay, the problems with the general theory of evolution, they just keep mounting up. Okay, we've already seen the problems with spontaneous generation, uniformitarianism, and radiometric dating. Now we've added to that the problems of irreducible complexity, synergistic organs, sex, cell division, morals. Fossils constantly define their predictions, dinosaur tissue plus historic records of dinosaurs being witnessed by humans, and then a bunch of failed missing links. Okay, that's what we've seen so far, and we will continue with this idea of missing links next time and mutations and all that kind of stuff, and we will finish the argument from Folly. But I'm hoping it's clear by this point that the general theory of evolution really is a fairy tale for grown-ups.